Back on Steel and Vance, and as promised before the break, Linda, we are going to have a conversation that no doubt will stir up the controversy when you start talking about gun ownership, the rights for and those against. It always gets people, I'm going to say it, fired up.
Well, there's a lot of polarization. You either like guns, you don't like guns. I actually went out about 2016 to a gun range with the publisher of Caliber magazine with my old co-host Drex from CKNW. He wanted to teach us more about guns. We shot handguns, we shot, automatic quote unquote assault rifles. He wanted to show us that there are legitimate law abiding gun owners who respect the rules and have to jump through a billion hoops to be able to have these weapons.
Yeah.
So the reason this is back in the news now is because now hunting rifles, some of them presumably, because it's very confusing, rifles like this, I think we have a picture. The federal government has dropped some last minute amendments to Bill C-21. It's gun control legislation that people are confused and think it might actually mean a banning of these weapons. And then we had the Montreal goaltender Carey Price put out a photo on Instagram in camo holding a rifle saying, "I am not a criminal or a threat to society." And people were mad because he put this out on the eve of the Polytechnique massacre and people thought it was insensitive.
A little tone
But
deaf
there's
there for
a
sure.
lot of confusion.
That was a little tone deaf. Like, let's acknowledge that, but that's a whole other conversation. For the sake of the gun discussion, what was that like for you on the gun range? I've had the opportunity to shoot a number in a very safe environment as well. How'd you find it?
It was fascinating. These weapons are expensive. They're powerful. They were well taken care of. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be with someone like we were, who were making sure we were doing things safely. You
Safety
could
protocol.
Kill someone easily with these, and I couldn't hear for about a day afterward. But that aside, I want to bring in a guy who's been following the ins and outs of the debate around gun control. Daniel Fritter is the owner and publisher of Caliber magazine. And Daniel is joining us from Kelowna. Thank you so much for doing this.
Happy to be here.
So let me ask you, I've sat through interviews. I've watched federal cabinet ministers twist and turn in the wind trying to say, oh, it doesn't mean we're banning hunting rifles. Well, actually, hunting rifles were used to kill people during the war, so we're going to ban them. Nobody seems to know what's going on. A couple of Liberal MPs have come out and said, this is too confusing. We need clarity. Do you know what's going on?
I mean, to a degree, I can tell you what the amendment says. It's difficult to know what their motives were with this because it is very confusing. Having watched all of the committee hearings on this since, it doesn't really seem like they have a good grasp of what this amendment's intended to do. You've got expert witnesses saying that it's not going to ban certain guns, while lawyers who are more expert on the law are saying, well, the way it's worded absolutely will ban a metric ton of hunting guns. And it doesn't really seem like it's particularly well thought out, which, I mean, it's an amendment being introduced at the 11th hour with no consultation. They can't hear from witnesses. It's exactly what you'd expect of the most far-reaching piece of gun control legislation in Canadian history, which this amendment is, being done with no consultation with any subject matter experts.
So when it comes to keeping people confused and having this be a very politicized, rather almost wedge issue, would this be like a tool that the government might be using? Because we are looking south of the border where gun laws are very, very different and sort of creating the illusion that somehow banning those single shot rifles that hunters might use will somehow protect people in Canada?
I don't know, and this is where it gets tricky, is I don't know if they necessarily intended to ban single-shot hunting rifles. I do think this is a wedge issue for the Liberals. We do know that Justin Trudeau's government has typically, well, not typically, but they've won the past 3 elections using a very efficient voter turnout in urban ridings where this sort of policy does resound and win a lot of votes. So it's worked for them up until this point. And I think that might be actually part of the problem is when they first passed the ban that prohibited many of the rifles that this amendment prohibits even further effectively. They used that against Aaron O'Toole to win the election in 2020. So they have used it in the past. I think this is probably an attempt to use it in the future. We've already heard the Liberals have been telling their MPs to prepare for potentially even a spring election. Then they introduced this right before the Christmas break. There's not a lot of legislature time to actually get this bill pushed through any further than it is, and they've been adamant that the prohibitions that would be instituted by these amendments would only be passed into law by OIC after the full bill of C-21 has received royal assent. So they need to get this whole bill through before they can get any of this stuff instituted. And if there's an election within the next 8 months, that seems like a hard task.
Yeah. Let's get real, though. Gangsters are running around with a hunting rifle. So even if they're banned, that's not going to stop gang crime.
No, and that's the biggest frustration that I've got is a lot of the discussion around C-21 and the controversial nature of it now is owing to largely, actually, if we just want to be blunt about it, Carey Price's Instagram post.
Yeah.
So it's frustrating, first of all, that it takes a social media post from a celebrity to get government to notice what advocates have been saying all along, that this amendment includes a whole lot of guns that are used by millions of Canadians, literally. But all of that overshadows the fact that C-21 was at its very root controversial in the first place because it only impacted guns owned by licensed individuals. If you'll recall, it banned the transfer of handguns between licensed individuals. So if you don't have a license, i.e. you're a criminal or a gang member that you don't have a registered handgun, it doesn't impact you. You don't call the RCMP and ask to transfer that firearm. So they're taking a law that the criticism was it doesn't impact criminals. And now the criticism has shifted to, well, now it's starting to impact hunters. It's going the wrong direction. It's supposed to be impacting criminals. And this discussion of hunters almost seems like a distraction from that.
It does seem like a distraction, and the fact that responsible gun ownership comes along with safety protocols that are pretty extensive.
Absolutely. If you have a firearms license in Canada, the big thing that people probably are most comforted to know is that everyone with a gun license in this country receives a daily criminal record check from the RCMP as part of continuous eligibility screening, because it's actually illegal to have a firearms license in this country while being charged with a violent crime. It's mutually exclusive, so the RCMP have a legal obligation to ensure that everyone that they have a license, that they've given a license to as they administer these licenses, they have a legal obligation to make sure that those people haven't been charged with violent crimes. So it's a 2.3 million people have these licenses, and they're responsible for a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the gun crime. Most estimates put it less than 2%. So the analogy I like to talk to a lot of people will draw a parallel to cars because of the registration argument of the past. But what's going on here with guns in Canada is effectively like trying to address the opioid poisoning epidemic by banning the prescription of morphine, because the only people that can get these guns legally are people that are very effectively screened. For example, if you wanted to buy an AR-15 in Canada when they were legal, you had to call the RCMP and get permission to take it home. It was that simple. Like you put your money down and then you'd call the RCMP and say, I'd like to buy this gun. And they'd say, yes, you're allowed to buy this gun. And by the way, you can take it home on this day. It's that thorough. So by banning guns, those are the guns that we're talking about. These are not the guns that they're finding in tents, in camps. These are not the guns that are in glove boxes owned by drug dealers. And I think from a public safety perspective, we have a lot of other things that are chronically underfunded that we really need to be focusing on.
Daniel Fritter, this is a fascinating conversation. I know we'll be talking about it again. Daniel's the publisher of Caliber Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
One of the many ongoing conversations we will have, Linda Steele, coming up on Steele and Vance, we are going to dip back into what has been a huge reaction from Steele and Vance viewers and followers on our conversation about medical assistance in dying. Actually, a viewer weighs in, and we'll get to that next on Steele and Vance.